welcome once again to the Questioning Christianity podcast with Rob and Dan. And we're coming to you. Rob I think you're sitting on your back porch, right?
Yes, I am, looking at the sunset.
Very cool. I am sitting in my back room looking at the computer screen. So, hey, thanks for tuning in, and check us out online at questioningchristianitypodcast.com. Make sure you subscribe and share the podcast with at least one friend this week. That'd be great. As we are recording this, it's April the 2nd, 2020, and we are still in the middle of this weird moment in history here for us. And but we're glad to be here and talking with you and talking about the sorts of things that we like to talk about on this podcast. So, Rob, you were telling me before that you guys were doing something a little bit different last week with your church. Since you can't meet together, you were going to try some kind of like a drive-by prayer service or something. Did that happen?
It did happen, and it went really well. Yeah, it went well. It wasn't. We didn't call it drive-by. We called it drive-through.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess either way, it would be okay. We're streaming our morning worship service, so people can go online and check that out. But also after the worship service, me and the other pastor went out into the parking lot, and we just stood on the sidewalk there, and people just drove their cars up. We kept the safe distance away from their car window, but they just rolled down their windows, and we said, "How can we pray for you?" And they shared their concerns or their request or whatever, and we prayed with them, and then pronounced a blessing on them, and then they drove on, and we had a lot of people respond to that.
I think that was a cool idea. I appreciate you sharing that. And on our last episode, we encouraged everyone to find ways to connect with people, and so I thought that was an interesting kind of outside the box way of doing that. So cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Today on the podcast, we're not doing a Corona-centric sort of episode. We're going to kind of go back to one of those childhood Bible stories, and one that maybe has like the best song. We're talking about the story of that wee little man, Zacchaeus.
Yeah, Zacchaeus.
So that's how you are supposed to pronounce it, Zacchaeus?
Well, that would be the Hebrew version of his name, yes.
And how do you say wee little man in Hebrew?
I have no idea.
No, okay.
No, well, I'm not the Hebrew guy. Can't help you out there. I'm sorry.
All right, well, that's a little bit disappointing.
I know.
Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed the sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Luke 19, 1 through 10.
At the beginning of the story, it says Jesus enters the city of Jericho and he passes through it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of this interesting little element that a lot of us, I think, read over. Why is that significant, that little detail? It sounds like the setting for a story, but there's actually something more significant to it than that.
Yeah, I think so. The broader context is that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Luke says that he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. In other words, he's setting out, he's determined to go to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the place where it's kind of like his destiny. The cross is the destiny. Up to this point, 3 different times he's told the disciples, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'll be handed over to the Gentiles. I'll be scourged. I'll be crucified. And then on the third day, I'll rise again. And they just don't get it. It's like it kind of goes over their heads. I mean, that's where he's headed, but he enters into Jericho, which is in the Jordan River Valley. And Luke tells us that he's passing through it. The reason I believe that's significant, I don't think that that's just, fluff that Luke is throwing in there. What would have been expected of a respected rabbi would be to, when you come into a town, you would be expected to stop and to pay your respects to the local rabbis and the leaders of the city. And you would be invited to a feast. And at the feast, you and the other rabbis would sit around and talk theology. And you would present your ideas and they would present their ideas. And then you would probably stay over there overnight, and then you'd continue your journey the next day. But Jesus doesn't do that. And in a way, it's, at least I think it could be understood that Jesus is kind of snubbing the religious system of his day. He is just kind of giving them the cold shoulder as he passes through.
Why do you think that is?
Well, all through the Gospels, of course, Jesus is living in tension with the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees. There's a couple of reasons for that. From the very beginning, Jesus does not fit into the mold that they believe that he should fit into. Primarily, the thing that he does that upsets them so much is that he socializes with sinners and tax collectors. Those are two groups that they specifically name. Sinners, that word was a kind of a technical designation for anyone who had done anything or lived in any kind of condition that made them unclean, which means they could not enter into the temple in Jerusalem to make sacrifice. So for a rabbi to be in the presence of an unclean person would then make that rabbi unclean, and he wouldn't be able to go. So Jesus made a practice of that sort of thing. In fact, he broke a lot of the rules and the regulations that the religious leaders valued very highly, and it just really, it got under their skin. They murmured all the time about his behavior, and they just didn't like it at all. And he didn't behave well when he was in the synagogues. He didn't preach what they wanted him to preach. Like in the beginning of Luke's gospel, the first time he goes into the synagogue in his hometown, he preaches a very inclusive sermon where he reminds people a couple of stories from the Old Testament where Gentiles get blessed by God, and that really burns them up. They're ready to kill him after that. In fact, they take him over to a cliff to throw him off the cliff. And Luke says he walks through the crowd. It's almost like a supernatural kind of thing. They can't touch him. So the religious system of Jesus' day, what we call Second Temple Judaism, did not get along with Jesus at all.
So Jesus snubs the religious crowd, and he hangs out with these sinners and these tax collectors.
Yeah.
And, one of these tax collectors is a wee little guy. How'd you say it? Zacchaeus?
Zacchaeus.
Yeah. I remember my preacher, when I was a kid, called him a publican.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's another name for tax collector.
Oh, okay. Because I looked that up, and it said person who owns or manages a pub.
Yeah, at least not in King James Day.
Okay.
That's the King James translation for tax collector.
Okay. So he's a publican.
Yep.
All right. Fair enough.
Publican, yeah.
So Zacchaeus gets up in this tree, and Jesus says, "Hey, man, get down. I want to go to your house." Is there anything weird about that? Or is that just kind of how Jesus rolls? He just picks a guy out of the crowd and says, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't feel comfortable just inviting myself to someone's house. Is that something that is more culturally relevant in this time?
Well, yeah. Of course, Zacchaeus is definitely one of these unclean people. He's a tax collector. When you think tax collector, think like an underboss in the mafia. He goes around and basically extorts money from people. And so he does that to his own people, his fellow Jews. And so he's hated by his own countrymen. But when Jesus invites him down out of the tree, it's not, they don't grumble and say he's gone home to be with a scoundrel or a thug or a turncoat. They grumble and say he's gone home to be with a sinner. So their problem is that he is entering into the home of an unclean person, which makes Jesus unclean from their perspective.
Okay, so their primary concern then is about sort of like the religious legalism, like the rules and such.
Exactly, yeah. One writer says that if Jesus had come up under the tree that Zacchaeus was in, and he had said something to the effect, Zacchaeus, you're a disgrace to your country. You're a traitor. You're a turncoat. You have joined forces with the unclean Gentiles to extort money from your own people. But if you will do what you're supposed to do according to our religious system, if you will give up your occupation of tax collecting, and if you will pay back the money that you've stolen as the Torah instructs you to, and you'll go to Jerusalem and you'll make sacrifice there and repent so that the priest can pronounce you clean, and then come home, maybe the next time I'm passing through town, I'll stay at your house. But Jesus bypasses all of that. Jesus goes home with Zacchaeus, and during the course of the meal, he says, salvation has come to this house. And it's like Jesus has kind of thumbed his nose at his whole religious system and pronounced salvation over a person who hasn't gone through the process that they were supposed to go through in order to be able to be saved. It would be like in the Baptist church that you and I grew up in, if a person, they didn't walk down the aisle, they didn't say the sinner's prayer, and they didn't get baptized in a pool of water, and they didn't join the church, but they claimed that they were saved, as we used to say. In that case, the pastor would say, oh no, you haven't done these things yet, so you can't say I got saved. You have to follow this list of things that you have to do. And so Jesus just didn't do that.
I gotcha. And I want to make sure that we don't start filling in the details in between the lines here from what, we experience. I'm using the collective we, all of us who are listening to the podcast. So Zacchaeus is not asking what he needs to do to be saved. And the idea of getting saved, is that even a thing at this point in history? Or is that something that people came up with years later?
No, not the way we think about it. See, typically, when we think about salvation, at least in the evangelical world, is that salvation is getting my ticket to heaven. And so I'm saved. That means I'm saved from hell, and I'm going to go to heaven. It's a very transactional understanding of our relationship with God. And it is typically, it's whatever system you come out of, it is really very transactional. It's, I give God something so that he's going to give me my ticket to heaven. So for instance, going back to our faith tradition, I grew up believing that I had to give God this prayer, and I had to really mean the prayer, and I had to believe a certain set of doctrinal statements. And these were all things that I transacted with God. I gave God these things so that he would give me my ticket to heaven. So whether your faith tradition is, if you resonate with that, or if it's something like, I'll be a good person, I'll do good works all my life, and then when I die, I'll get my ticket to heaven. Or if it's, I'll go through confirmation and join the church, then I get my ticket to heaven. All of those different systems are very transactional systems designed to assure our place in heaven, which is, you're right, that would have been totally foreign to the ancient world. Instead of thinking about kind of a transactional understanding of salvation. I think we need to think more of a transformational understanding of salvation. It's not a transaction that I do with God so that I get to go to heaven. It's a transformation that happens in my life so that heaven comes rushing into my life in the here and the now. And that, I think, is a more biblical understanding of salvation. It's definitely getting rescued, which is at the root of what the word salvation means, to be rescued, to be liberated. The first time we see the word salvation in the Bible, or at least one of the earliest times, is when Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he stands out beside the Red Sea, and of course the Egyptian army is bearing down on them, and Moses holds the rod out over the Red Sea, and he says, "Behold the salvation of the Lord," and the Red Sea parts. So that their salvation is they get away from the Egyptian army. They cross the Red Sea. It's all about deliverance, but it came to be more of a deliverance from who I am. I don't want to be this person anymore. So transform me, save me, make me a different person. And so I think that is a better understanding of what salvation means.
Gotcha. A couple of things I want to follow up with you on. That makes sense. So when, I guess, traditionally growing up in the Bible Belt, when we think of salvation, we think of salvation from hell. And like you said, ticket to heaven. But if we change our definition of that word salvation, I think something that a little more closely aligns to what would have made sense to first century Jew here, of being rescued or redeemed. So what happens before Jesus says, "Today salvation has come to this house"? Zacchaeus makes this proclamation that says he's going to give half of everything he owes to the poor. And if he's cheated anybody, he's going to pay them back 4 times as much. And so then Jesus says, "Today salvation has come to this house." So I'm saying this because I want to make sure that this is right. So correct me if I'm wrong, I should say. Zacchaeus's proclamation is not some statement that gets him a ticket to heaven. No. What Jesus says is basically Zacchaeus was a slave to, I guess, greed, to sin, to the system, and now he has realized that he is free from that. Is that close?
Exactly. Sure, absolutely. You're dead on, Dan. You're a great theologian.
Oh, gosh.
Zacchaeus, up until this time, he's a rich person, but apparently, as the story unfolds, we see that Zacchaeus is not a happy person. His life is not full and rich. He's got money, but his life is empty. And Jesus unconditionally goes to his house. Jesus hadn't said anything, or at least Luke doesn't record Jesus saying anything about, Zacchaeus, I want to bring salvation to your home, or Zacchaeus, I want to go with you to Jerusalem so that you can make sacrifices.
Or Zacchaeus, if you died today, do you know what would happen to your soul? Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you know for sure that you would go to heaven? None of that. Jesus just says, "Zacchaeus, I just want to go home with you." And they go home together, and the very presence of Jesus, you have to understand the Gospels always help us see, if you just read through the Gospels, you'll see that the very presence of Jesus in people's lives is a transforming power. People just get changed around Jesus. It happens over and over again. And so the very presence of Jesus with Zacchaeus brings about this transformation that results in him doing the things that the law requires. The law required that a person would make restitution. If they get caught stealing from their neighbors, they were to make restitution. I can't remember. It was, I don't want to misquote it, but it stipulated exactly in percentages exactly how much restitution had to be made. And Zacchaeus says, "The half of my goods I give to the poor." Right off the top, I'm going to cut my 401k in half and give that to the poor. And if I've stolen anything, I'm going to return it fourfold. And Jesus doesn't say, "Well, since you're going to do that, Zacchaeus, I'm going to pronounce you saved." It's not that. It's that Jesus acknowledges the transformation that's already happened. And he says, "Look, that's what salvation is. There's salvation. Salvation has come to this house. So it's exactly 180 degrees opposite of what religious systems tell us. Religious systems say, do this and this and this and this, and you will be saved. Jesus says, I've come to save you, no strings attached. And then people who truly believe that, well, lo and behold, they go out and do this and this and this, not in order to be saved, but because they have been saved.
Because they've been transformed.
Because they've been transformed. Exactly.
Why is it that we have to add the strings? Some things, I guess, are just timeless human qualities, whether you're first century Judaism or Southern Baptist or whatever. We want to add rules and steps. And we even take a story like this where Jesus says, screw these steps.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, so here's an example of a guy who got saved. Now, if you want, and so then we start adding steps.
Yeah, exactly.
We just can't help ourselves.
We need to feel like we're participating in our own salvation.
That's interesting. Maybe, I hadn't thought about that before.
But the central message of the scriptures is that actually we don't participate in our own salvation. That's the whole redemptive part of it, that it comes to us without us doing anything. Now, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian, means that I am going to follow Jesus, and I'm going to pattern my life after the life and teachings of Jesus. But that's not so that I can get saved and get to heaven or whatever. That's because I am so attracted to Jesus, so drawn to the life of Jesus, so infatuated with Jesus that I have this drive to follow him, to live out my life the way that Jesus teaches us to live out our lives. But that's not, in order so that I can get saved. Salvation, it just comes to us. Just like God sent Moses to the children of Israel, they weren't doing anything but making bricks. God sent him, and they got led out of Egypt, and they didn't do doodly squat. They didn't do anything, except walk out the day that Moses said we're leaving. So, same thing all the way through the Bible.
So I guess maybe we can think about where we fit into this story. So in a way, Zacchaeus is just a guy who is curious about Jesus. He's not particularly religious, this Zacchaeus. In fact, he's, I guess, maybe the opposite of that. He's a traitor to his people and to their religion. But he's curious. And so he invites, Jesus kind of invites himself over. I can imagine that there are folks that maybe listen to the Questioning Christianity podcast who are curious about Jesus. Is there a 21st century equivalent of Jesus inviting himself over? How does this story, I guess, relate to us today if we are in that role of Zacchaeus?
That's a good question. There's probably lots of different maybe connections to it. Luke is careful not to tell us why Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. He just says he wants to see Jesus. Now, it could be that he is just simply curious. I certainly wouldn't rule that out. It could be that somewhere along the line, Zacchaeus has heard about this rabbi, this Jewish religious leader who actually parties with sinners. He eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners, and he says, I got to see who this guy is. And that's what drives him to go out and climb the tree. If I had to take a guess about Zacchaeus and about basically just human nature in general, I think that we are a jumble of motivators most of the time. I think that there are people in the world who are simply spiritually curious people. They wonder about, I think maybe they have an intuition that there must be some other realm out there besides just the realm that we live in, and they're spiritually curious. And maybe it's a combination of that and also this sort of nagging feeling that we have deep down inside somewhere that says there must be more than this. There must be more to life than what life has become for me. And for, 2,000 years, people have been drawn to this person, Jesus, in whom they found the answer to that nagging question. The modern connection might be those commonalities that we have with our ancestors all the way back through history that, there's more to life than perhaps what we're experiencing. And could it be that this person, Jesus, was actually right? And what he lived and what he taught was right. And so, I guess I would say to our listeners, if any of this resonates with you, and maybe it won't, but, and I'm not twisting your arm, but if any of this resonates with you, I would just encourage you to maybe just begin to do some sort of intentional investigation into the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ and see for yourself if that life draws you in. Give it a try.
Let us know what you think. Our email address is info@questioningchristianitypodcast.com. You can also send us a message through Facebook. That's facebook.com/questioningchristianity. And it is fun to get messages from the folks who listen to our podcast. And we've gotten several from from different parts of the world even. And so even in the midst of this kind of weird situation, it would be great to hear from you. Just let us know if you're doing all right. It would be awesome to hear from you. So reach out to us this week. And if you have any questions or suggestions for an upcoming episode, let us know that too, because we'd love to address those questions. Rob, anything that we want to add to this before we hit the stop button?
Probably not, Dan. I feel like I've been pretty long-winded tonight anyway.
Yeah, well, there's a reason you feel that way.
Because it's true.
No, man, it's cool. I always enjoy talking to you, and every once in a while I can hear the birds chirping, and so that's really pleasant. It's a beautiful evening out tonight here in North Carolina, and so I think I'm going to go sit outside for a little bit too.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
All right, thanks, Rob. I'm Dan, and we'll see you next time on the Questioning Christianity podcast.